This is David Hildebrand, and this is going to be a lecture on Plato, particularly on the selection in the dialogue The Gorgias, in which Socrates and Callicles debate what makes for a good life. In the lecture to come, we'll talk about pleasure, particularly whether or not we can make distinctions between different quantities of pleasure and different qualities of pleasure. We'll talk about roughly the difference between pleasure on the one hand and happiness or goodness on the other. We'll give a little bit of background on the dialogue, and then we'll get into the conversation that Socrates has with Callicles. This is in the Gorgias from 481b to 522e. We'll lay out Callicles' position and Socrates' critique of Callicles' position. After that, we'll make some side connections or some contemporary connections, and we'll look at Socrates' toughest question, whether or not all pleasures can be considered good. We'll see that Callicles objects to Socrates' tough question, particularly his example of the catamite. I'll end with some final thoughts about some distinctions that are being made or assumed in the dialogue, particularly the one between instrumental and intrinsic value, and then we'll talk briefly about another way to picture what's going on or what's at stake in the dialogue, and that'll wrap it up. So to begin with, let's consider pleasure and how we distinguish between pleasures. We all know that there are different intensities or quantities of pleasure. That's pretty easy. But are there different levels of pleasure quality? Are there higher or lower qualities of pleasure? And what makes the difference between different qualities of pleasure? So, for example, is the pleasure of music higher or better than the pleasure of eating pie? Is an intriguing puzzle a more worthwhile pleasure than taking a nap? How about a well-done theatrical play? Is that a more refined pleasure than pro wrestling? So, when we think about pleasure and we try to make distinctions between different qualities of pleasure, one of the ways that philosophers have done this is to think about the fact that pleasures of a higher quality are typically more enduring. They're more continuous. Maybe they're more rare. They're more intense or novel, or maybe they happen more propitiously, they're more timely, or maybe they're a certain kind of pleasure that's replenishing of our energies and our spirit. In short, there are different ways to discriminate among pleasures, and it's helpful, I think, for you to think about whether or not your tastes have changed in a way that allows you to say, my tastes are evolving, or I have higher orders or levels of pleasure now than I did when I was younger, or when I was a child, or when I was different in some way. So if this is the case, if you can make distinctions between qualities of pleasure, the question becomes, how do pleasures evolve? What's added to a pleasure that makes it better, or more sophisticated, or more rewarding? Another way of thinking of this question, perhaps in the sort of larger frame in which we're thinking, is if you had the choice between living as a fully contented animal or as an infrequently satisfied human being, right, infrequently satisfied with higher quality pleasures, which would you choose? Now, of course, the central question for this dialogue and for lots of other philosophical readings, such as Robert Nozick's piece on the experience machine, we need to determine whether or not there is an actual real difference between a pleasurable life and a good or happy life. So we see in this dialogue from Plato, in the Gorgias, there's this debate between Socrates and Callicles, and Nozick's piece on the experience machine, for example, opens up this question as to whether or not we would want to hook up to a machine that would give us all the experiences we could possibly imagine, and that would be the entire sum of our life. And would that be a good or a happy life in the same sense that a pleasurable life is a pleasurable life? So let's consider what's happening in this dialogue itself. Now, this is from the Platonic dialogue, the Gorgias, and it's about rhetoric as an art, about speaking in convincing and beautiful ways, and it's about good and evil in political activity. Now, Gorgias was a citizen of Leontini in Sicily, and he was a diplomat and negotiator on behalf of Sicily. He was also a traveling teacher. He was a sophist, teaching people how to win arguments, give speeches, right, be influential through speech. So now Gorgias travels from city to city, and he's typically accompanied by his pupil Polus, teaching the art of making speeches. And while he's in Athens, he's staying at Callicles' house. Now, Callicles is depicted as a man who's quite active in Athenian politics. He's probably fictional, but we're not sure. At any rate, in this dialogue, Callicles meets Socrates and Chaerephon in the street and invites Socrates home to hear a demonstration of Gorgias' skill. So we're coming in on the dialogue just at the point where Socrates and Callicles are engaging on a particular question. So this is a part of the dialogue where Socrates is not speaking with Gorgias, but he's speaking with Callicles. So Socrates and Callicles are having this conversation, and the central question is, well, what is a happy life? After all, everybody wants to have a happy life. Now, does this just mean that everyone wants as much pleasure as possible? Is that just what people are after? So take a look at the following words. Think about whether or not you consider them to be synonyms or whether you make distinctions between them. Happy and pleasurable, do those mean the same thing to you? Meaningful and amusing, significant and fun, fulfilling and comfortable, valuable and satisfying. Now, these words have different meanings, of course, but are they roughly equivalent, or are some of them getting at or pointing at a different kind of life? This is kind of an exercise, but it's a way of trying to get at the two different concepts that are being contrasted here, and which Callicles wants to collapse and Socrates wants to keep separated. So what is Callicles' position? Well, for Callicles, pleasure just means the satisfaction of the strongest possible desires. And he says, well, who should we consider great or admirable people? Well, these are the ones who know how to live well. And in Callicles' view, living well means cultivating your passions, cultivating your appetites to the greatest possible extent, and then finding the courage and the intelligence to satisfy all of them. You learn to love the good life, and then you make it happen no matter what. So the aim of life is a kind of connoisseurship of pleasure, and the money or power necessary to acquire that. What does Callicles think about moderation or temperance or self-control? Well, these things, right, self-control, that's for fools. The right use of intelligence and bravery is for gratifying our urges to the fullest. We are not supposed to use intelligence and bravery to suppress our desires or to control ourselves. No, you want to take those strengths and get what you want. So for Callicles, what's the good life? What is virtue? For Callicles, the good life is one that's filled with luxury, filled with excess, right? These just are virtue and happiness. There's no more to happiness than maximum pleasure. The only things that one, quote, ought to do is what's truly natural, to have powerful desires and to fulfill them. Well, why, Callicles, do so many people preach moderation or temperance? Well, his answer to that is well, look at the person who's preaching moderation or temperance. These are people who are frustrated. They can't get their share of pleasure. Either they lack the courage or the intelligence or the money or the power or whatever. They condemn the haves because they are the have-nots. There's no moral reason behind their judgment. There's no moral motive to saying we should be restrained, no matter what they tell you. It's impotence and envy that motivates them. They are just powerless to get what they naturally desire. So the worldview or the philosophy of life that we're seeing from Callicles is a hedonistic worldview. The Callicles worldview is something like this. Might makes right. Pleasure is what people want. Power is what gets it. People who don't have power just rationalize that by inventing something higher than pleasure. But there's nothing really higher than pleasure, and it's foolish to think that there is. So Callicles has laid out a point of view and a worldview that Socrates does not agree with. And Socrates takes aim at Callicles' position by pointing out that the life that he's describing is one of perpetual craving. This is a case where the mind or the body is never at rest. It's kept constantly occupied with this craving, satisfying cycle, back and forth. This is a kind of life that Socrates says, this is like a leaky pitcher or a leaky cask or a sieve. There's just this continual flow of pleasure that's depleted, and that's all that happiness comes to for Callicles. But Socrates says this constant craving and filling and craving and filling, this is constant misery. So Callicles' position is just entailing that pleasure just collapses with goodness and happiness, and Socrates says, no, they are distinct. He refuses the idea that a pitcher or a sieve or a leaky cask are equivalent to the happy life. And he raises for Callicles to consider the objection of the catamite. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Before moving on to Socrates' I think, devastating critique of Callicles, you might consider some side connections that we could make with the debate happening here between Callicles and Socrates. Think about the expectations that are set up for us by a consumer society, by a media and advertising and marketing operation of contemporary life. There are many impossible reference groups for us, many things that we are set up to want, to desire, to idealize, to think is normal. And we have constant encouragement to equate these things with happiness. If we get these things, we will be happy. If we consume these things, we will have a meaningful life. And so this is really still part of the equation, part of the debate that we all have with one another about how to live and to how to run our lives and our economies and what to base our values on. So let's come back to Socrates' tough question as to whether all pleasures are good, because if pleasure is the only good, then all pleasures are good. Socrates starts pressing Callicles about pleasures that are harder and harder to call sufficient for a good life or even part of a good life. He asks about the person who is the lifelong scratcher, who always has an itch and always gets it scratched. Is this a happy life? I mean, it seems kind of pathetic and sort of crudely physical, but if all there is to life is to having a pleasure, seeking a pleasure and having it fulfilled, then this seems like a happy life. So given this example, Callicles agrees that that would have to count as a happy life. You can see this at 495 A through C. Then Socrates asks what I think is the killer objection. He says, how about the life of the catamite? A catamite was a boy who was kept for sexual favors among older men. Now this is something which is very, very hard for Callicles to accept into his argument. So you can see in the dialogue that Callicles objects to Socrates' example of the catamite. He takes the catamite example as over the line, as morally reprehensible. But the problem here is that as long as he identifies the good with the pleasant, he cannot object to this. To condemn any kind of gratification, you must distinguish good from pleasant, and Callicles cannot do this consistently. As long as they collapse into one another, then any pleasure which someone acquires must be good. So a couple final thoughts about what's happening in the dialogue. Socrates is essentially proposing some very important distinctions. He's proposing the distinction between what is instrumentally good and what's intrinsically good. So some things are instrumental goods and other things are intrinsic goods. An instrumental good is something that's only good because it leads to something further that's intrinsically good. Some things, on the other hand, are intrinsic goods. They don't serve any further purpose, but they're good. So some examples might be, money is instrumental to obtaining delicious food, and that's just intrinsically pleasurable. Books are instrumental to obtaining knowledge, and that's an intrinsic good. Exercise is instrumental to obtaining health, and that's intrinsically good. So the point here is that whether something is a pleasure doesn't tell us if it's instrumentally or intrinsically good. It certainly doesn't guide us towards moral ends, and moral ends are all intrinsically good. What we understand here is that some things may be pleasurable and good, but other things are not pleasurable, but they're still good. Do you see the difference there? So an example of some things that are good but are not usually pleasurable, right, helping to make that distinction between good and pleasure is it is good to accept responsibility for doing something wrong, but that's not typically something pleasurable. It's good to punish someone who has done wrong, even a loved one, and that's usually not pleasurable. It's good to forgive someone who has hurt you, and that's not typically pleasurable, but it is good. Another one might be giving enormous amounts of money or goods to charity anonymously. This is something that's good, but it's not typically pleasurable. Sometimes it is, but you can see how those things could be distinguished. So one final way to picture this is to think about two different sentences. One is to think of the sentence, well, he lived a good life, though much of the time he wasn't having much pleasure. Maybe that happened because this person sacrificed a lot for others. Compare that with the other sentence. He lived a pleasurable life, but it wasn't a good life. Right? Maybe because, he ran off with the babysitter, or he ratted on his friends, or he was just cheap with people who needed his help. So we can think of two different ways of thinking of a life which describes and articulates this conceptual distinction between goodness and pleasure, the one that Socrates is arguing for in this part of the dialogue, the Gorgias. So that's the end of this lecture on the section between Socrates and Callicles in Plato's dialogue Gorgias. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to speaking with you about it.